What you are about to hear is a work of fiction. The people, places, and events depicted in this story are products of the author's imagination or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual individuals, living or deceased, or to real situations is purely coincidental. These stories may explore themes of crime, injustice, and human suffering. While fictional, they reflect real emotions and difficult truths that some may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
You trusted me with everything, Ruth, and now you have nothing left. Those words would echo in Ruth Patterson's mind for weeks to come, but they also marked the beginning of her fight back against the man who had systematically robbed her of nearly everything she had. This is the story of how a 61-year-old retired librarian and her loyal friend turned the tables on a neighborhood predator who thought he had found the perfect victim. Please, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know just how far our stories reach. Ruth Patterson had lived on Maple Street for 30 years, watching the quiet suburban neighborhood evolve from young families with small children to a mix of retirees and new homeowners. At 61, she was a fixture in the community, the former head librarian who had helped countless children discover their love of reading, the neighbor who brought casseroles when someone was sick, and the woman whose garden was always the envy of the block. But 3 months ago, Ruth's carefully ordered world had been disrupted by a fall down her front steps that resulted in a fractured hip and surgery. The recovery had been slower than expected, leaving her bedridden for weeks and dependent on others for the first time in her adult life. About 3 weeks after coming home from the hospital, when bills had piled up and Ruth worried constantly about missing payments while confined to bed, Kevin had suggested a practical solution. He had driven her to the bank, supporting her with his arm as she hobbled inside on her walker. "It's just a limited power of attorney for bill paying," Kevin had explained as the bank officer presented the documents. "This way you won't have to worry about late fees or missed payments while you recover." Ruth, grateful for his thoughtfulness and overwhelmed by her circumstances, had signed the papers without reading them thoroughly. It seemed like such a reasonable arrangement at the time. "I never thought I'd be the one needing help," Ruth said to herself as she struggled to reach the remote control from her hospital bed, which had been set up in her living room for easier access. The October afternoon sun streamed through her lace curtains, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. Her walker stood nearby, a stark reminder of her temporary limitations. The doorbell chimed, its familiar melody echoing through the house. Ruth called out, her voice carrying down the hallway. "It's open!" Kevin Morse stepped through the front door, carrying a bag of groceries and wearing his characteristic smile. At 45, Kevin was what many would call conventionally handsome tall, with graying temples and an easy charm that had served him well in his various careers. He had moved in next door 2 years ago after his divorce, and while Ruth had been friendly but cautious at first, his helpfulness during her recovery had gradually worn down her natural reserve. "How are we feeling today, Ruth?" Kevin asked, setting the groceries on the coffee table within her reach. "I picked up those things you needed from the store. The pharmacist said your prescription should be ready tomorrow." "You're too kind, Kevin," Ruth replied, though something in his tone always made her feel slightly uncomfortable, as if she were a burden rather than a neighbor receiving help. "How much do I owe you?" "Don't worry about it right now," Kevin said, waving his hand dismissively. "We'll settle up later. Speaking of which, your Social Security check should be arriving any day now. Just let me know when it comes in and I'll deposit it with the others." Ruth nodded, though a small frown creased her forehead. "It seems like the timing has been off lately." "The mail service has been unreliable," Kevin explained smoothly. "That's why it's good that I can handle your banking for now. These scammers are targeting elderly folks, especially those who are vulnerable. It's better if I take care of everything until you're back on your feet." Ruth felt a flash of irritation at being called elderly, but she pushed it aside. Kevin was helping her after all. Since her surgery, he had taken over managing her bills, depositing her checks, and even doing her grocery shopping. It was a relief not to worry about these mundane tasks while she focused on healing. "I appreciate everything you're doing," Ruth said. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Kevin's smile widened, but there was something predatory in his eyes that Ruth couldn't quite identify. "That's what neighbors are for. Now let me get these groceries put away for you." As Kevin moved around her kitchen with a familiarity that struck Ruth as odd when had he learned where everything went, she heard the distinctive sound of her mail truck pulling up outside. Through her window, she could see Janet Williams, her postal carrier for the past 15 years, walking up the front path with her usual brisk efficiency. Janet was a sturdy woman in her early 50s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and sharp eyes that missed nothing on her route. She had worked for the Postal Service for over 20 years and prided herself on knowing every resident on her route, their habits, and their concerns. "Afternoon, Ruth," Janet called out as she entered. She and Ruth had developed a friendship over the years, built on daily conversations about everything from the weather to local gossip. Janet's visits had become even more important during Ruth's recovery. "Janet, how lovely to see you," Ruth said, genuinely pleased. "Any interesting mail today?" "Just the usual bills and advertisements," Janet replied, but her eyes were on Kevin, who had emerged from the kitchen. "Oh, hello, Kevin. Taking good care of our Ruth, I see." "Just doing my neighborly duty," Kevin said, his tone pleasant but guarded. "Ruth's been through a lot with the surgery and all." Janet nodded, but something in Kevin's demeanor set off alarm bells in her mind. In her years of delivering mail, she had developed an instinct for people and situations that weren't quite right. There was something possessive in the way Kevin spoke about Ruth, as if she belonged to him rather than being an independent woman temporarily needing assistance. "Well, I should get going," Kevin said, checking his watch. "Ruth, I'll stop by tomorrow to take care of those bank deposits. Rest up." After Kevin left, Janet lingered, ostensibly organizing the mail but actually studying Ruth's face. The older woman looked tired, but there was something else, a subtle confusion that hadn't been there before her accident. "Ruth, honey, how are you really doing?" Janet asked, settling into the chair Kevin had vacated. "I mean, beyond the physical recovery." "I'm fine," Ruth said, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's just... well, I've always been so independent. Having to rely on someone else for everything feels strange." "Kevin seems very involved in your affairs," Janet observed carefully. "He's been wonderful," Ruth said, though her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as Janet. "He handles all my banking now, pays my bills, does my shopping. I couldn't manage without him." Janet's frown deepened. In her experience, when someone took over every aspect of an elderly person's life, it wasn't always out of kindness. "Ruth, do you still have access to your bank accounts? Are you seeing your statements?" "Kevin handles all that," Ruth replied. "He reviews my statements and tells me about anything important. He says it's too stressful for me to worry about detailed finances while I'm recovering." The warning bells in Janet's head grew louder. "Ruth, I think you should." "Oh, I'm sure I'm just being paranoid," Ruth interrupted, forcing a smile. "Kevin has been nothing but helpful. I'm probably just not used to accepting help." Janet left shortly after, but she couldn't shake her unease. That evening, as she completed her route, she found herself paying closer attention to the mail going to Ruth's address. Over the next few days, she noticed something troubling. Kevin always seemed to be around when Ruth's important mail arrived, appearing at her door within minutes of delivery to help collect it. The first time it happened, Kevin explained that he was saving Ruth the trouble of walking to the mailbox. But when Janet saw him quickly pocketing what looked like a Social Security check without mentioning it to Ruth when she answered the door, her suspicions crystallized into certainty that something was very wrong. Meanwhile, Ruth was beginning to have her own doubts. Small things at first: Kevin's explanations for why her bank statements looked different, his insistence that she didn't need to worry about her finances, and his subtle discouragement of visits from other neighbors and friends. I'm concerned about people taking advantage of you," Kevin had said just the day before. "There are so many scams targeting people in your situation. It's better if I handle everything until you're completely recovered." But Ruth had been a librarian for over 30 years. She was used to research, to asking questions, to verifying information. The more Kevin insisted she didn't need to worry about details, the more she wanted to see those details for herself. The breaking point came on a chilly November morning. Over the past few weeks, small discrepancies had been nagging at Kevin's vague explanations about her finances, his reluctance to show her detailed statements, and his insistence that she didn't need to worry about complicated banking matters. Ruth had managed to make it to her kitchen to make coffee a small victory in her recovery when she decided to call her bank to check her balance. She hadn't looked at her account in weeks, trusting Kevin's assurances that everything was fine. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Patterson," the bank representative said after Ruth provided her information. "Your checking account balance is currently $247. Ruth nearly dropped the phone. "That can't be right. I should have several $1,000s. My Social Security, my pension, my savings." "Let me check your recent transactions," the representative said. Ruth could hear typing on a keyboard. "I see multiple withdrawals over the past 2 months, most of them at ATMs or cash checks. The amounts range from $300 to $800 each." Ruth's hands began to shake. "I haven't written any checks or used an ATM. I've been bedridden." "Mrs. Patterson, I think you should come in to speak with our fraud department. Can you visit the bank today?" Ruth hung up the phone with a trembling hand. The room seemed to spin around her as the implications of what she had just learned sank in. Helpful, charming Kevin had been stealing from her. Not just small amounts, but systematically draining her accounts while she lay helpless in her bed. She made her way to her bedroom and found her purse, fumbling for her checkbook. Page after page of checks had been torn out, leaving only the carbon copies. Her signature appeared on each copy, but as she looked closer, she realized the handwriting wasn't quite right. Someone had been forging her signature. The sound of her front door opening made her freeze. Kevin's voice called out from the living room. "Ruth, I brought your lunch from that deli you like." Ruth quickly stuffed the checkbook back into her purse and made her way back to the living room, her mind racing. She had to act normal until she could figure out what to do. "Kevin, how thoughtful," she managed, settling back into her hospital bed. "You look pale," Kevin observed, his eyes studying her face. "Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired," Ruth lied. "Kevin, I was wondering if I could see my latest bank statement. I'd like to review my finances." Kevin's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but Ruth caught at a flash of something cold and calculating before his smile returned. "Ruth, we've talked about this. The stress of managing money isn't good for your recovery. Trust me, everything is fine. But I'd still like to see." "Ruth," Kevin's voice took on a firmer tone, "I'm handling this for your own good. The last thing you need is to worry about numbers and details while you're healing." For the first time, Ruth heard the underlying menace in Kevin's voice. This wasn't a helpful neighbor speaking. This was someone who had taken control and didn't intend to give it back. That afternoon, when Janet arrived with the mail, Ruth was ready. "Janet, I need to speak with you privately," Ruth said, glancing around to make sure Kevin wasn't nearby. Janet immediately recognized the urgency in Ruth's voice. "What's wrong?" "I think Kevin has been stealing from me," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I called the bank this morning. My accounts have been drained." Janet's face hardened. "I knew something wasn't right. Ruth, I've been watching him. He's always there the moment your important mail arrives, collecting it before you even know it's come." The two women looked at each other, the weight of the situation settling between them. Ruth felt a mixture of betrayal, anger, and fear. She had trusted Kevin, had been grateful for his help, and he had repaid that trust by systematically robbing her. "What do we do?" Ruth asked. Janet's expression was grim but determined. "We catch him in the act, and then we make sure he pays for what he's done to you." Over the next several days, Janet and Ruth developed their plan. Janet would help Ruth set up a small hidden camera in the living room, positioned to capture Kevin's activities. Ruth would also secretly document everything she could remember about the missing money and forged checks. Janet's nephew, David, worked in the fraud prevention department at a local bank. When Janet explained the situation, he agreed to help them build a case that would hold up in court. "The key is catching him in the act," David explained during a quiet visit to Ruth's house. "We need video evidence of him forging signatures or manipulating documents. Then we involve law enforcement." Ruth felt nervous about the deception, but her anger outweighed her discomfort. Kevin had betrayed her trust in the worst possible way, taking advantage of her vulnerability when she needed help most. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Janet had coordinated with Ruth to watch for her pension check, and when it arrived, Ruth was ready. When Kevin arrived for his usual visit, Ruth was ready. "Kevin, I was expecting my pension check today," Ruth said, trying to keep her voice casual. "Has it arrived yet?" "Let me check the mail," Kevin said, heading toward the front door. He returned a moment later with an envelope. "Here it is. I'll take care of depositing it for you as usual." Ruth's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "Actually, I'd like to endorse it myself this time. Could you bring me a pen?" Kevin's smile faltered slightly. "Ruth, there's no need for you to worry about that. I'll handle it like always." "I insist," Ruth said, her voice firmer than it had been in months. "It's my check, Kevin." The mask finally slipped from Kevin's face. His expression turned cold and calculating as he realized Ruth was no longer the compliant victim he had been manipulating. "You trusted me with everything, Ruth," Kevin said, his voice devoid of the warmth he had shown before. "And now you have nothing left." The words hit Ruth like a physical blow, but she had expected this moment. The hidden camera was recording everything, and she knew Janet was listening from the kitchen. "You're right, Kevin," Ruth said, surprising him with her calm response. "I did trust you, and you stole from me." Kevin laughed, a harsh sound that filled the room. "Prove it. Who's going to believe you? A confused old woman who can barely take care of herself? I believe her." Janet stepped into the room, her phone in her hand. "And so will the police, who I just called. They're on their way." Kevin's confidence cracked. "You can't prove anything. It's my word against hers." "Actually, we can prove quite a lot," Ruth said, reaching for a folder she had hidden beside her bed. "Like these bank records showing the withdrawals you made. And the forged signatures that don't match my handwriting. And the video we just recorded of you admitting you stole from me." Kevin's face went white as he realized he had been caught. He looked around the room like a trapped animal, his charm and manipulation useless now that his victims had turned the tables on him. "You don't understand," Kevin said, his voice becoming desperate. "I needed the money. I have debts, obligations. You weren't using it anyway." "That wasn't your decision to make," Ruth said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "You took advantage of me when I was vulnerable. You betrayed my trust." The sound of sirens grew louder as police cars pulled up outside. Kevin made one last attempt to appeal to Ruth's sympathy. "Ruth, please, we can work this out. I'll pay you back. You don't need to involve the police." But Ruth was done being manipulated. "The only thing I need is to see you face the consequences of what you've done." The police officers who entered Ruth's house were thorough and professional. Detective Maria Santos, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, took Ruth's statement while her partner dealt with Kevin. "Mrs. Patterson, what you've described is a clear case of elder financial abuse," Detective Santos explained. "The evidence you and Miss Williams have gathered will be very helpful in prosecuting this case." As Kevin was led away in handcuffs, he made one final attempt to maintain his innocence. "This is all a misunderstanding. Ruth authorized everything." But his protest fell on deaf ears. The evidence was overwhelming, and his own recorded confession had sealed his fate. In the days that followed, the full extent of Kevin's crimes became clear. Ruth wasn't his first victim. Detective Santos discovered that Kevin had a pattern of targeting elderly or vulnerable neighbors, gaining their trust, and then systematically draining their finances. Ruth had been his most recent and most successful target, but there were at least 3 other victims in different neighborhoods where he had lived. The good news, Detective Santos told Ruth during a follow-up visit, is that we can trace most of your money. Kevin hadn't moved it offshore or anything sophisticated like that. Much of it is still in accounts we can freeze and recover. The bank's fraud protection also kicked in, covering a significant portion of Ruth's losses. Within a month, she had recovered nearly 85% of her stolen money, with the promise that civil seizure of Kevin's assets would recover the rest. But more important than the money was what Ruth had regained, her sense of self and her confidence. The experience had been traumatic, but fighting back had reminded her that she was stronger than she had realized. "I never thought I'd be grateful for being robbed," Ruth told Janet as they sat in her living room sharing coffee and cookies on a sunny December afternoon. "But this whole experience taught me something important." "What's that?" Janet asked, settling into the chair that Kevin had once occupied. "That being vulnerable doesn't mean being helpless," Ruth said. "Kevin thought he could take advantage of me because I was injured and dependent on others. But he underestimated both of us." Janet smiled. "He definitely didn't expect us to fight back." "I also learned something else," Ruth continued. "Real friendship isn't about one person helping another. It's about people looking out for each other." The trial took place in the spring, just as Ruth was finally able to walk without assistance. She testified clearly and firmly about Kevin's betrayal, describing how he had systematically isolated her from her support network while draining her accounts. Kevin's defense attorney tried to paint Ruth as a confused elderly woman who had simply forgotten giving Kevin permission to handle her finances. But the evidence was too strong, and Ruth's testimony too compelling. "Mr. Morse took advantage of my client's temporary vulnerability," Ruth's attorney, a sharp woman recommended by Janet's nephew, argued during closing statements. "He saw an opportunity to exploit an elderly woman's trust, and he took it. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a favor gone wrong. This was calculated theft." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges: elder abuse, identity theft, forgery, and fraud. Kevin was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to all his victims. As Ruth left the courthouse, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. Kevin had hurt her, but he hadn't broken her. If anything, the experience had made her stronger and more aware of her own resilience. "How does it feel?" Janet asked as they walked to her car. "Like justice," Ruth replied. "Not revenge, just justice." 6 months later, Ruth had fully recovered from her hip surgery and was back to her normal activities. She had even started volunteering at the local senior center, helping other elderly residents recognize and avoid financial scams. "The most important thing to remember," Ruth told a group of seniors during one of her presentations, "is that asking for help doesn't mean giving up control. Real helpers respect your independence. Anyone who tries to take over your life completely is someone to be wary of." After one such presentation, an elderly man approached her. "Mrs. Patterson, I think someone might be trying to scam my wife," he said quietly. "Could we talk?" Ruth smiled. "Of course. That's exactly why I'm here." As she helped the man understand the warning signs of financial abuse, Ruth reflected on how much her life had changed. The woman who had been afraid to question Kevin's control over her finances was now confidently helping others protect themselves from similar predators. That evening, as Ruth tended to her gardeno in full summer bloom, Janet stopped by after finishing her mail route. "How was the presentation today?" Janet asked, settling into one of Ruth's patio chairs. "Good. I think I might have helped prevent another Kevin situation, Ruth said, deadheading the roses with practiced efficiency. You know what I think? Janet said, watching her friend work. I think Kevin picked the wrong victim. He thought he found an easy target, but what he actually found was a woman who wasn't about to go down without a fight. Ruth paused in her gardening and looked at her friend. We found that, Janet. Both of us. I couldn't have done this alone. Maybe not, Janet agreed. But you had the strength to fight back when it mattered. Kevin learned too late that being 61 doesn't mean being defenseless. As the sun set over Maple Street, Ruth felt a deep sense of contentment. Her house was secure, her finances were under her control, and her independence was intact. More importantly, she had learned that accepting help didn't require surrendering autonomy, and that real friends would never ask her to. Kevin Morse had thought he was preying on a vulnerable elderly woman, but he had encountered something far more formidable, an intelligent, determined woman with a loyal friend and the courage to fight for what was right. In the end, the predator had become the prey, and justice had been served with the quiet satisfaction that comes from turning the tables on someone who underestimated the strength of their intended victim. Ruth Patterson was 61 years old, a retired librarian with a bad hip and a trusting nature. But she was also a survivor, a fighter, and a woman who had learned that vulnerability and strength could coexist in the same person. Kevin Morse had tried to steal her money, her independence, and her dignity. In the end, all he had accomplished was revealing just how strong she really was. Thank you for listening until the end. If you enjoyed the story, please consider leaving us a like. This helps us reach more people.